My wife died 2 months ago. At the will reading, her parents tried to steal my inheritance. He was just her nurse. The money is ours. The lawyer smirked and pulled out a hidden envelope. My wife died exactly 2 months ago. At the will reading, her parents demanded my inheritance. Those words were the starting line of a story I shared on a forum over a year ago, written in a state of absolute, bone-deep exhaustion and white-hot fury. Today, 14 months after the world stopped turning, the dust in the courtroom has finally settled, and the silence in my house is no longer a scream. I think I am finally strong enough to tell you how it all really happened. My name is Nolan. I am 46 years old. My wife, Sylvia, was only 44 when her body finally surrendered after a life spent fighting a war from within. It is a strange, cruel thing to refer to her in the past tense. To say she was instead of she is. For 16 wonderful, heartbreaking, and chaotic years, my entire life was synchronized with her heartbeat. Every morning in our Boston home, my internal clock was not set by the alarm on my phone, but by the subtle sound of her shifting under the blankets or the heavy, measured rhythm of her breathing when the pain in her joints was acting up. Now, I wake up at 6 o'clock every single morning, and the absence of her presence feels like a physical weight on my chest. I still walk into her studio every day, just to stand in the middle of the room and breathe in the faint, lingering scent of oil paints and vanilla candles. I have not moved her digital drawing tablet a single inch from the spot where she left it on that final, rainy Tuesday. Her digital pen is still resting on the right side of the desk, perfectly aligned with the edge of her tablet, just the way she liked it. Every time I see the dust starting to gather on her things, a fresh wave of panic hits me. It feels like as long as I keep everything exactly as it was, she is just in the other room, or maybe she just stepped out for a moment to grab a coffee. But then the silence returns, thick and suffocating, reminding me that she is gone. Losing a spouse is a crater in your soul that nothing can fill, and even though we knew this day was coming for 16 years, the reality of it feels like being hit by a freight train. I find myself wandering through the grocery store aisles, staring blankly at the shelves for 45 minutes, only to realize I have a carton of organic almond milk in my hand, the kind only she drank. I stand there in the middle of the aisle, a grown man nearly 50 years old, feeling the hot sting of tears because my brain hasn't caught up to the fact that I only need to buy coffee for one person now. Grief is not a quiet thing. It is a series of ambushes. It hits you when you find a stray hair tie in the pocket of an old winter coat, or when you hear a specific jazz record playing in a cafe. The world outside my window keeps moving. People in Boston are rushing to work, cars are honking, and the seasons are changing from a bitter, gray winter into a cold, hesitant spring. I want to step out onto my porch and scream at the world to stop. How can everyone just keep living their lives when Sylvia is not here to see the flowers bloom? But I know what she would say. She would tell me to stop being so dramatic and to go finish the code for my latest client. She was the strongest person I have ever known, fighting a ticking clock with more grace than most people live their entire, healthy lives. She deserved better than the family she was born into, and she certainly deserved a peaceful legacy. Instead, her death became the catalyst for a greedy, ugly battle that revealed the true nature of the people she shared blood with. We met in our late 20s, back when I still thought the world was a predictable place. I was a junior software engineer at a high-pressure tech firm, obsessed with climbing the corporate ladder and hitting my performance milestones. Sylvia walked into a tiny, cramped coffee shop in downtown Boston on a day when the sky was the color of wet concrete. She was wearing this vibrant, bright yellow scarf that seemed to defy the entire atmosphere of the city. We started talking over a shared table, and by the time I finished my second cup of black coffee, I knew I was in deep trouble. She was brilliant, sharp-witted, and had this laugh that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. By our third date, she decided it was time to be honest. We were sitting on a park bench near the harbor, the wind blowing cold off the water. She turned to me, her face serious, and told me about her autoimmune disorder. She had been diagnosed when she was only 8 years old. She did not sugarcoat it. She told me about the inflammation that attacked her organs, the chronic fatigue that could leave her bedridden for weeks, and the statistical reality that her life expectancy was significantly shorter than most. She told me that being with her meant signing up for a life of hospitals, medication schedules, and uncertainty. She gave me an out. She told me, clearly and without a hint of judgment, that if I wanted a normal life with someone who could promise me 40 years of health, I should walk away right then and there. I looked at her, at that bright yellow scarf, and at the incredible strength in her eyes, and I realized there was no choice to make. I did not want a normal life with anyone else. I wanted a life with her, however long that might be. I told her I would rather have a handful of years with her than a century with someone who did not set my soul on fire. I meant it then, and I mean it now. When we got married 2 years later, we promised to love each other in sickness and in health. Most people say those words without ever thinking they will have to prove them before they turn 30. For us, the sickness part started almost immediately. Within the first year of our marriage, she had a major flare-up that required a 3-week hospital stay. I realized very quickly that my corporate job was not going to work. I could not be sitting in a meaningless strategy meeting while she was lying in an emergency room bed 40 minutes away, scared and in pain. So, I walked into my boss's office, resigned from my position, and started working as a freelance developer. It was a massive financial risk. I lost my 6-figure salary and my premium health insurance, but I gained the ability to work from a hospital chair. I became her primary caregiver, her medical advocate, and her constant shadow. I learned the names of every drug, the side effects of every infusion, and the exact tone of voice to use when a nurse was not taking her pain seriously. I spent 16 years as a full-time husband and a part-time nurse, and I would do it all over again in a heartbeat if it meant I could have one more afternoon with her. People often talk about the emotional toll of chronic illness, but they rarely talk about the cold, hard numbers. In the 16 years we were married, we spent more money on medical expenses than most people spend on their entire mortgages. Because Sylvia's condition was so rare and aggressive, many of the treatments that actually worked were considered experimental by the insurance companies. That is a polite way of saying they refused to pay for them. There was one specific round of cutting-edge biologic therapy that cost $12,000 per infusion. She needed 4 infusions every 3 months. Do the math, and it is enough to make your head spin. We were constantly fighting with insurance adjusters, filing appeals, and looking for ways to cut costs without sacrificing her quality of life. At one point, about 7 years into our marriage, we hit a wall. Our savings were depleted, and a new treatment was our only hope of preventing permanent organ damage. I owned a 1968 Classic Mustang. It was my absolute pride and joy. I had bought it as a rusted-out shell when I was 22 and spent 5 years restoring it piece by piece in my father's garage. I loved that car. But when the choice is between a beautiful piece of vintage metal and my wife's ability to breathe without a machine, there is no choice at all. I sold that car to a collector in Connecticut for $45,000 on a Tuesday morning. I handed over the keys, watched it being loaded onto a trailer, and walked back into our house to tell Sylvia that the treatment was paid for. I never told her how much it hurt to watch that car drive away, and she never asked, but I think she knew. We made those kinds of sacrifices constantly. But Sylvia was not just a patient. She was a fighter who contributed every ounce of energy she had. She was a gifted illustrator, and even on the days when she could barely sit upright, she would use her digital tablet to work on projects for major publishing houses. She was smart, too. She insisted on being paid partly in stock options for several of the tech startups she illustrated for in the early 2000s. We lived on my freelance income and her base pay, while those stocks sat in a private portfolio, growing silently in the background for over a decade. We built a secret fortress of financial security that neither of us ever touched, even during the leanest years. We treated that portfolio as her legacy fund, something to ensure that whichever one of us was left behind would never have to worry about the bills again. We were a team in every sense of the word. We shared the pain, the bills, and the secrets. What we did not share was that information with her family, because we both knew instinctively that Margaret and Richard only cared about things that could be measured in dollar signs. One of the most agonizing chapters of our life together was the decision regarding children. About 5 years into our marriage, we sat in a small, windowless office of a high-risk pregnancy specialist. We had been quietly, hopefully discussing the possibility of starting a family, despite the risks. The doctor was a kind woman, but she didn't mince words. She told us that the hormonal shifts of pregnancy combined with the necessity of stopping Sylvia's most effective medications would be a death sentence. She said the chance of a fatal flare-up during the second trimester was over 70%. Even if she survived the pregnancy, the physical stress of labor would likely shave 20 years off her already shortened life expectancy. I remember the walk to the car after that appointment. The sun was shining and people were pushing strollers in the park across the street. We sat in the car for a long time, the engine off, just listening to the sound of our own breathing. I looked at Sylvia and told her, "I don't want a baby if it means losing you. You are my family. You are enough for me." She cried then, a deep, mourning sob for the children we would never get to meet. We made a pact that day to pour all the love and energy we would have given to our children into each other and into the life we had left. We traveled whenever she was healthy enough to fly. We went to art galleries in London, ate pasta in tiny villages in Italy, and spent weeks just sitting on beaches in the Caribbean, soaking in the sun. We built a home that was a sanctuary, filled with books, art, and memories that belonged only to us. We chose each other over everything else. My in-laws, however, never understood this. Margaret would make passive-aggressive comments at every holiday gathering, asking when we were finally going to give them some grandkids. When I tried to explain the medical risks, she would wave her hand and say that women have been having babies for thousands of years and that we were being overly dramatic. Richard would just grunt and say it was a shame the family name wouldn't be carried on through Sylvia's line. They saw our decision not as a heart-wrenching sacrifice for survival, but as a personal failure on our part. They couldn't fathom a life where the husband's primary role was to protect his wife's health instead of producing heirs. This disconnect only deepened the divide between our quiet, focused life in Boston and their loud, status-obsessed world in Lexington. They didn't see the bravery in our choice. They only saw the absence of the grandchildren they felt they were owed. If you want to understand why the Will reading turned into a war zone, you have to understand the environment in Lexington. Margaret and Richard lived in a massive, pristine colonial-style house that looked like it had been staged for a luxury real estate magazine. Everything was white, cream, or gold. There was never a stray shoe in the hallway or a dirty dish in the sink. It was a house built for entertaining important people, not for living a real, messy life. Margaret was the queen of the local country club, a woman who measured her success by the brand of her handbag and the number of gala invitations on her marble countertop. Richard was a retired executive from a major pharmaceutical company, a man who spoke in bullet points and viewed empathy as a sign of professional weakness. They had 3 children, and in their eyes, only 2 of them really mattered. Preston and Dalton were the golden sons. They were both in their late 30s, loud, aggressive real estate developers who spent most of their time talking about market disruption and their latest luxury car purchases. When they walked into a room, they took up all the air. They were the perfect reflections of their father's ego. And then there was Sylvia. To her parents, Sylvia was a ghost daughter. Because she was sick, she couldn't play the role of the high-achieving, status-boosting child they wanted. Her illness was an inconvenience to their narrative of a perfect, genetically superior family. Whenever we visited Lexington for the holidays, Sylvia was treated like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. Her brothers would brag about their million-dollar commissions while Sylvia sat quietly, trying to hide the fact that her hands were shaking from her latest infusion. Margaret would talk incessantly about Preston's new boat, but if Sylvia mentioned a new art project she was working on, Margaret would just nod absently and ask if she had tried that new miracle juice diet she heard about on the news. They didn't want to hear about the reality of her life. They wanted her to be a background character in their play. I remember one specific dinner where Richard stood up to give a toast. He praised Preston for his business acumen and Dalton for his warrior spirit on the golf course. He didn't even mention Sylvia. Not a word. I sat there, gripping my napkin so hard my knuckles turned white, while Sylvia just gave me a small, sad smile under the table. She was used to being invisible to them. I was the only one who truly saw her, and that made me an outsider in their Lexington fortress. They viewed me as the nurse, a utility player who was there to manage the problem child so they didn't have to. They were more than happy to let me handle the emergency room visits and the sleepless nights, as long as it didn't interfere with their social schedule. The event that finally broke any lingering sense of loyalty I had toward my in-laws happened 5 years ago during Thanksgiving. We had made the 45-minute drive from Boston to Lexington, despite Sylvia having a particularly difficult week. She was in the middle of a major flare-up, and every movement was a struggle. But Margaret had insisted, claiming it would look bad if the whole family wasn't together for the annual photo. We were sitting at that massive mahogany table, the air thick with the smell of roasted turkey and expensive wine. Sylvia was sitting next to me, her face pale, barely touching her food. Halfway through the meal, she had a sudden, violent spasm of pain in her chest, a common but terrifying side effect of her condition. She let out a small, muffled gasp and her hand flew to her heart, her eyes widening in distress. I immediately dropped my fork, put my arm around her, and reached for the emergency medication in her purse. The entire table went silent. Margaret didn't ask if her daughter was okay. She didn't offer a glass of water. Instead, she slammed her crystal wine glass down on the table with a sharp clack and let out a loud, dramatic sigh. "Sylvia, really?" Margaret snapped, her eyes flashing with annoyance. "Do you have to do this right now? We are in the middle of a beautiful dinner. Can't you just hold it together for 1 hour without making yourself the center of attention? You're ruining the mood for everyone." I was stunned. I felt the blood rush to my face, a heat so intense it felt like I was standing next to an open flame. I looked at Richard, expecting him to say something to his wife, but he just shook his head and turned to Dalton. "So, Dalton, tell us more about that $300,000 condo flip in the North End," Richard said, his voice booming as if nothing had happened. Dalton launched into a loud, obnoxious story about outbidding a rival developer, and the rest of the table joined in the laughter. They literally ignored Sylvia as she sat there, struggling to breathe. I didn't say a word. I didn't scream, although every nerve in my body was telling me to flip the table. I just stood up, helped Sylvia into her coat, and walked her out the front door without saying goodbye. We drove back to Boston in total silence, the only sound the heater humming in the car. When we got home, I carried her into the house and held her on the couch for 3 hours while she cried. She realized that day that she was an island, and I was the only person on it with her. Her parents didn't love her. They tolerated her existence as long as it wasn't depressing. From that night on, we stopped pretending. We attended the bare minimum of family events, and I stopped calling Margaret with medical updates. I realized then that if Sylvia ever truly needed them, they wouldn't be there. And I was right. During the final 2 years of Sylvia's life, the distance between us and her family became a canyon. Her condition moved into a terminal phase, and our lives were consumed by the grueling routine of palliative care. We spent more time in the oncology and rheumatology wings of the hospital than we did in our own living room. I sent regular text updates to a family group chat, keeping them informed of the milestones, the failed treatments, the new pain management protocols, the days when she was too weak to speak. The responses from the Lexington crowd were always the same: a single thumbs up emoji from Preston, a praying for you from Margaret that felt as hollow as a drum, or a keep us posted from Richard. Not once in those 24 months did any of them offer to bring over a meal. Not once did they offer to sit with her for 3 hours so I could go home and take a shower or sleep in a real bed. The most damning moment came during her final 2-week stay in the ICU. The doctors had pulled me aside and told me it was time to call the family. I called Margaret and told her plainly that Sylvia didn't have much time left. I told her that Sylvia was asking for her. Margaret's response was a knife to my heart. "Oh, Nolan," she said, her voice sounding strained and inconvenienced. "It's just so hard for me to see her like that. You know how sensitive I am. Hospitals give me such terrible anxiety, and Richard has that big charity golf tournament this weekend. We'll try to make it up there on Monday or Tuesday when things quiet down." They never came. Monday turned into Wednesday, and Wednesday turned into Friday. Sylvia passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning at 4 o'clock. I was holding her hand, whispering to her how much I loved her, how proud I was of her, and how it was okay to let go. She was surrounded by my love, but her blood family was nowhere to be found. They claimed later that the traffic from Lexington was unusually heavy that morning and that they had just missed the moment. It was a lie. They hadn't even left their house yet. They showed up at the hospital 2 hours after the nurses had already moved her, looking for a place to get a good cup of coffee. That was the reality of their devotion. They were absent when she was gasping for air, but as I would soon discover, they were the first in line when it came time to talk about the bank accounts. The funeral was a disgusting display of hypocrisy. Margaret wore a black veil and cried more loudly than anyone else, playing the part of the grieving mother for her social circle. Richard stood tall and somber, accepting condolences as if he had been by Sylvia's side every day. Preston and Dalton acted like they had lost their best friend. I sat in the front row, feeling like I was trapped in a fever dream. I didn't speak to them. I couldn't. I just wanted to get through the day and go back to my empty house. 2 months later, the call came from Mr. Caldwell, Sylvia's attorney. He told me it was time for the formal reading of the will. I arrived at the office in downtown Boston, a place of dark wood and the smell of old paper. The in-laws were already there, sitting in a row like a panel of judges. They didn't look like they were mourning anymore. They looked like they were waiting for a business deal to close. Preston was checking his gold watch, and Dalton was tapping a rhythm on the arm of his chair. They didn't even look at me when I walked in. Mr. Caldwell entered the room, carrying a thick manila folder. He looked at the family, then at me, and gave a small, professional nod. He began reading the standard introductory clauses, establishing the legality of the document. I could feel the tension in the room rising. Margaret was leaning forward, her eyes locked on the paper in the lawyer's hands. She wasn't thinking about her daughter's soul. She was thinking about the stock portfolio. She was thinking about the house. In her mind, she was about to be rewarded for the burden of having a sick child. She had no idea that Sylvia had been watching them just as closely as they had been watching her assets. If you are enjoying the story so far, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below with the name of the city you are living in. Every single comment helps push this video to a wider audience, and I truly appreciate your support. Mr. Caldwell's voice remained flat and professional, a sharp contrast to the predatory energy vibrating from the other side of the table. He cleared his throat and continued reading the primary distribution of assets. He listed the deed to our Boston home, the joint savings accounts, and the life insurance policies. But then, he reached the section regarding Sylvia's independent business assets. He described the portfolio of stock options she had accumulated over 16 years of illustrating for some of the biggest tech and publishing firms in the country. He read the numbers slowly, and I could see Richard's eyes widen as he mentally calculated the current market value of those shares. It was a staggering amount of money, far more than even I had fully realized. Then came the hammer blow. Mr. Caldwell read the specific clause. All remaining assets, including but not limited to the stock portfolio, intellectual property rights, and future royalties from my body of work, are to be bequeathed in their entirety to my husband, Nolan. He has been my sole partner in life and my only support in illness, and it is my express wish that he be provided for as he provided for me. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds before the room erupted into a scene of pure, unadulterated ugliness. Margaret was the first to snap. She slammed her designer handbag onto the mahogany table with a sound like a gunshot and stood up so fast her chair screeched against the floor. Her face, usually so carefully composed for her Lexington social circles, was contorted into a mask of twisted rage. "Absolutely not," she shrieked, her voice hitting a pitch that made my ears ring. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. This is a scam. You manipulated her. You sat in that house for 16 years and brainwashed her into cutting out her own flesh and blood. Richard stood up beside her, his face a dangerous shade of purple. He didn't look like a grieving father. He looked like a CEO losing a hostile takeover bid. That money belongs to the family, Richard barked, his voice booming in the small office. Those stocks were earned while she was our daughter. It is blood money, and it belongs in the bloodline. You are an outsider, Nolan. You were nothing more than a glorified servant who happened to have a marriage license. Our daughter's money belongs to her brothers. Preston and Dalton joined the chorus, their voices overlapping in a chaotic mess of entitlement. Dalton started yelling about how he had already looked into those stocks and knew they were worth millions. Preston was calling for an immediate stay of the will, accusing me of elder abuse and medical coercion. They called me a parasite. They called me a gold digger. Margaret delivered the final, most venomous insult of all. You think you're special because you stayed? You were just her nurse, Nolan. That was your job. You don't get paid millions of dollars for doing what a hired healthcare worker could have done for $20 an hour. Give us what belongs to us. I sat there, my hands folded on the table, feeling a strange sense of detachment. I looked at the people who had refused to visit her when she was gasping for air in the ICU, the people who had skipped her chemotherapy appointments for golf tournaments, and I felt a cold, hard clarity. They didn't see Sylvia as a person. They saw her as a biological investment that had finally matured, and they were furious that the dividends were being paid to someone else. I didn't defend myself. I didn't point out that I had sold my most prized possession to pay for her medicine. I just watched them reveal their hollow, greedy souls to the man who held all the legal power in the room. Mr. Caldwell did not raise his voice. He didn't bang his fist on the table. He simply sat there, watching the Lexington family spin out of control with the calm, clinical interest of a man watching a car crash in slow motion. When the screaming finally died down into a series of heavy, angry breaths, he adjusted his glasses and looked at Margaret. If you are quite finished with your performance, Mr. Caldwell said, his voice dropping to a quiet, lethal register, there is a second part to this proceeding. Sylvia was a very thorough woman. She anticipated exactly this reaction, and she left specific instructions for how to handle it. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a smaller, heavily sealed envelope. It was cream-colored, with Sylvia's distinctive, elegant handwriting on the front. The room went silent again. I could see the greed reigniting in their eyes. They probably thought this was a consolation prize, a secret trust fund, or a cash payout she had tucked away just for them to keep the peace. Margaret sat back down, smoothing her skirt, a look of smug expectation returning to her face. Mr. Caldwell broke the wax seal with a silver letter opener and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Sylvia requested that I read this letter aloud if, and only if, her primary will was challenged during this meeting, he said. He began to read, and his voice took on a sharp, mocking edge that I knew was exactly what Sylvia had intended. To my mother and father, Margaret and Richard, the letter began. You often complained that my illness was a burden on the family image. You told me that seeing me sick was too depressing for you to witness. Therefore, I am relieving you of any further burden. To the two of you, I leave the 2 large boxes of old family photo albums currently stored in our attic. Since you are so fond of the image of our family, you may spend your retirement looking at those pictures and remembering the daughter you chose to ignore when she was actually alive. Margaret's jaw dropped. She looked like she had been slapped across the face with a wet towel. But Mr. Caldwell wasn't done. He turned his gaze to the brothers. To my brothers, Preston and Dalton, he continued reading. You have spent the last few years measuring your worth by the size of your real estate commissions and the horsepower of your cars. You couldn't find the time to drive 45 minutes to see me, but I know you spent plenty of time checking the ticker symbols of my stock portfolio. To each of you, I leave exactly $2,000. I calculated this amount based on the average cost of gas and tolls for the trips you never took to the hospital. Consider it a refund for the effort you never made. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence of total, humiliating defeat. Sylvia had not just disinherited them, she had quantified their lack of love and given it a price tag. She had turned their own greed against them in the most public way possible. Richard was the first to find his voice, but it was no longer a boom, it was a growl. "This is an insult," he hissed. "This is evidence of a disturbed mind. She wasn't herself when she wrote this. We're going to fight this. We're going to drag you through every court in this state until there's nothing left of that portfolio but legal fees." Margaret stood up, her eyes burning with a hatred that was truly terrifying. "Enjoy your little victory while it lasts, Nolan," she spat. "Because we are going to destroy you. We'll prove you coerced her. We'll prove she was mentally incompetent. We'll make sure you end up with exactly what you deserve. Nothing." They stormed out of the office, slamming the heavy wooden door so hard it shook the bookshelves. I sat there, staring at the empty chairs. Mr. Caldwell let out a long, slow breath and looked at me. "Nolan," he said quietly, "she told me they would do this. She knew. Now, you need to listen to me carefully. They aren't bluffing. They have the money to tie this up for a long time. You need to hire a litigation shark, and you need to do it today." The formal legal papers arrived exactly 19 days later. I was sitting on my back porch, drinking a cup of coffee and trying to remember what it felt like to have a normal day when a man in a cheap suit walked up the driveway and handed me a thick manila envelope. I didn't even have to open it to know what was inside. Margaret and Richard had officially filed a lawsuit in the Suffolk County Probate Court to contest Sylvia's will. They weren't just challenging the distribution of money, they were attacking the very foundation of our 16-year marriage. The lawsuit alleged that I had exercised undue influence over my wife. It claimed that I had systematically isolated her from her family, controlled her medications to keep her in a state of confusion, and manipulated her into signing her assets over to me while she was mentally incapacitated by her illness and heavy painkillers. Reading those allegations felt like having someone spit on Sylvia's grave. They were calling me a predator. They were saying that the 16 years I spent holding her hand during fevers, carrying her to the bathroom when she was too weak to walk, and sacrificing my own career were all part of a long con to steal her stock portfolio. The sheer, breathtaking hypocrisy of it was enough to make me lose my lunch. These were the people who hadn't called her for months at a time, now claiming they were the rightful protectors of her legacy. I knew I couldn't use Mr. Caldwell for the actual trial. He was a transactional lawyer, a man of contracts and peace. I needed a wartime general. I did exactly what Sylvia's letter had implied I should do. I went to the most expensive, most ruthless estate litigation firm in Boston and asked for Mr. Harrison. Mr. Harrison was a man who looked like he was carved out of granite. He had a reputation for being a shark, a lawyer who didn't just win cases, but dismantled his opponents until there was nothing left but dust. During our first meeting, I laid everything out. I showed him the medical records, the logs of their absence, and the nurse insult from the will reading. I told him about the classic car I sold and the sleep I lost. He listened for over an hour without interrupting. When I finally finished, he leaned back in his chair and adjusted his gold cufflinks. "Nolan," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "They're making a classic mistake. They're assuming that because you are a quiet, grieving man, you're a weak man. They think they can bully you into a settlement because you won't want to see your wife's medical history dragged through a public courtroom. But they've handed us a gift. By alleging undue influence, they've opened the door for us to show exactly what kind of influence you actually had. We aren't going to settle. We're going to go to discovery, and we're going to let their own records hang them." The cost of hiring Mr. Harrison was astronomical. The retainer alone was $25,000, and his hourly rate was more than I used to make in a week as a freelancer. But I didn't care. I looked at the folder containing their lies, and I thought of Sylvia's smirk. I realized that the money in that portfolio wasn't just for my retirement. It was the war chest she had built specifically to make sure her blood family would never win. I signed the check and felt a cold, sharp sense of purpose for the first time since the funeral. The battle had begun. The next 6 months were a slow, grinding descent into a mountain of paperwork. In a lawsuit like this, there is a period called discovery, where both sides are legally required to hand over every single piece of evidence related to the case. Margaret and Richard's lawyers were relentless. They demanded every medical record Sylvia had ever had. They demanded my bank statements, my emails, and even the journals I kept during her final years. They were looking for any crack, any moment where I sounded frustrated, or any medical note that mentioned she was disoriented. But Mr. Harrison was 3 steps ahead of them. While they were digging through our trash, he was launching a surgical strike on their lives. He subpoenaed the phone records of all 4 of them: Margaret, Richard, Preston, and Dalton. He demanded their credit card statements, their travel logs, and their email archives for the last 5 years. I spent my nights in my home office, going through thousands of pages of my own medical logs. I had kept meticulous records, every dose of medicine, every fever spike, every doctor's name. I had a paper trail of 16 years of devotion. On the other side, Mr. Harrison was building a paper trail of their abandonment. One night, Mr. Harrison called me into his office. He had a stack of printed spreadsheets on his desk. "Look at this, Nolan," he said, pointing to a highlighted section. "We just got the phone records for the final 6 months of Sylvia's life. During that time, she was hospitalized 4 times for a total of 58 days. Do you know how many times her mother, the devastated plaintiff, called her cell phone or the hospital room during those 58 days? I shook my head. "Once." "0, Mr. Harrison said, a grim smile touching his lips. "Not a single call. Not a single text message. But look at this other spreadsheet. This is Dalton's internet search history from his work computer during those same months. On the day Sylvia was in the ICU with a pulmonary embolism, Dalton spent 2 hours researching the current valuation and dividend yield of her specific tech stocks. He wasn't checking to see if his sister was alive. He was checking the market to see how much his inheritance was growing. It was the same for the rest of them. We found emails from Preston to Richard discussing which real estate projects they could fund once the situation with Sylvia was resolved. We found travel records showing Margaret was at a luxury spa in Arizona on the day Sylvia had her major kidney surgery. They had even coordinated their stories in a group chat, discussing how they needed to act sufficiently shocked by the will so they could justify the lawsuit. The deeper we dug, the more we realized that Sylvia had been right all along. They didn't just ignore her, they were actively rooting for her clock to run out. They viewed her life as a hurdle standing between them and a windfall. Every time I felt tired, every time I felt like the legal fees were becoming too much, I would look at those spreadsheets. I would see the 0 calls from her mother and the stock valuation searches from her brother, and my resolve would harden into diamond. I wasn't just defending my money, I was defending the truth of who these people were. They had tried to paint me as a villain in their fictional story, but the digital footprints they left behind were painting them as the vultures they truly were. The turning point of the entire war happened in a sterile, windowless conference room on the 20th floor of a skyscraper in downtown Boston. This was the deposition, the part where the lawyers get to question the witnesses under oath. Margaret and Richard arrived looking as if they were going to a royal wedding, dressed in their finest Lexington attire, clearly believing their social status would protect them from the consequences of their lies. Mr. Harrison started with Margaret. He was incredibly polite at first, almost charming. He asked her about her childhood with Sylvia, her deep bond with her daughter, and her devastation over the illness. Margaret played the role perfectly, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief and talking about how heartbreaking it was to see her daughter so isolated by that man, meaning me. Then, Mr. Harrison leaned forward and his voice turned into a razor blade. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, using her formal name, "you testified that you were constantly involved in your daughter's care. Can you please tell the court the name of the primary medication Sylvia took to prevent her organ rejection during the last 3 years of her life?" Margaret froze. Her hand stopped midair. She stammered, looking at her lawyer for help. "Well, it was a lot of things. Nolan handled the pills. He wouldn't let me see the labels. I see, Mr. Harrison said, pulling a document from his folder. So you don't know the name of the medicine. Let's try something simpler. Can you name the hospital where your daughter spent her final 48 hours? Margaret's face turned a blotchy red. It was one of the big ones. In the city. Everything was so chaotic. It was Massachusetts General, Mr. Harrison said flatly. A 10-minute drive from where we are sitting. Now, let's look at Exhibit 42. These are your cell phone records. On the night your daughter died, you were at a fundraising gala for the Lexington Historical Society. You didn't answer 3 calls from the hospital. You didn't answer 2 calls from Nolan. In fact, you didn't even check your messages until 10 o'clock the next morning. Is that correct? Margaret started to sputter, her grieving mother, mask slipping to reveal the cold, arrogant woman underneath. I had my phone in my coat. It was a very loud event. And besides, Nolan was always exaggerating her condition to get attention. Mr. Harrison didn't stop. He turned to Richard and asked him to explain why he had authorized a $300,000 luxury kitchen renovation on the same day the doctors told him Sylvia was terminal. He asked Preston and Dalton to explain their internet searches for stock prices while their sister was in surgery. He systematically dismantled every single lie they had built. By the end of the second day, the room was thick with the scent of their desperation. They had been caught in dozens of contradictions. They couldn't name her doctors, they couldn't name her medications, and they couldn't explain why they were completely absent during her most critical moments. The undue influence, they alleged, was revealed to be nothing more than the natural consequence of them being terrible parents. I was the one there because they chose not to be. When we walked out of the office that day, Mr. Harrison patted me on the shoulder. Nolan, he said, did you see Richard's face when I showed him the kitchen renovation invoices? They know it's over. They're no longer fighting for the inheritance. Now, they're just fighting to keep their reputations, but it's too late for that. The record is public now. I looked at the sunset over the Boston skyline, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could finally take a full, deep breath. The truth was on the table, and it was uglier than anything they could have imagined. The final hearing took place on a cold, rainy Tuesday, the same day of the week Sylvia had died. We were in a historic courtroom with high ceilings and heavy oak benches. Margaret and Richard sat as far away from me as possible, looking pale and significantly less confident than they had 6 months ago. The gold had started to flake off the Lexington fortress. The judge was a formidable woman with gray hair and eyes that seemed to see through every bit of theater. She didn't waste any time. She had read all the deposition transcripts and reviewed the mountains of evidence we had provided. She looked at Margaret and Richard, and the look on her face was one of pure, unadulterated disgust. In 30 years on the bench, the judge began, her voice echoing in the silent room, I have seen many families torn apart by greed. But rarely have I seen a case so devoid of merit, or a family so devoid of basic human compassion. The plaintiffs have alleged that Nolan exercised undue influence over his wife. However, the evidence shows the exact opposite. The only influence in this marriage was 16 years of unwavering devotion, sacrifice, and care provided by a husband who stayed when everyone else, including her own parents, found it too inconvenient to show up. She leaned forward, her gaze pinning Richard to his seat. The record shows that while this man was selling his personal property to pay for medical treatments, you were searching for stock yields and planning kitchen renovations. You weren't excluded from her life. You abandoned her. And now you have the audacity to come into this court and claim you are the rightful heirs to the fruits of her labor? It is offensive. It is an insult to the institution of marriage and to the memory of the deceased. The judge's gavel hit the wood with a sound like a thunderclap. The lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice. The will stands exactly as written. Furthermore, because this court finds that this action was filed in bad faith and was entirely frivolous, I am exercising my authority to order the plaintiffs to pay the defendants' legal fees in their entirety. A collective gasp went up from the in-laws' side of the room. Mr. Harrison's bill was not just high, it was life-changing. Between the 6 months of discovery, the expert witnesses, and the depositions, the total was well over $200,000. For Preston and Dalton, whose real estate businesses were already struggling in a cooling market, this was a crushing blow. For Margaret and Richard, who had spent their savings on their social image, it meant they would likely have to sell their pristine Lexington home just to pay for my lawyer. They had come for the inheritance, and instead, they had been ordered to pay for the privilege of being humiliated in public. As I walked out of the courtroom, Richard tried to stop me in the hallway. He looked 10 years older, his expensive suit hanging loose on his frame. "Nolan," he rasped, his voice shaking. "We need to talk. This fee, it's going to ruin us. We're family. Surely we can work something out." I looked him in the eye, the man who called me just a nurse, and I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity, just a cold, dead emptiness. "You're right, Richard," I said, my voice calm and steady. "A husband gets nothing. And a family that doesn't show up for life doesn't get to show up for the money. You have a 30-day deadline to wire the funds to Mr. Harrison's office. I suggest you call a realtor." I walked past him and didn't look back. I drove to the cemetery and sat by Sylvia's grave for an hour. I told her that the house was safe, the stocks were safe, and that her blood family had finally been held accountable. I left a single bright yellow scarf on the headstone and drove home to the silence of our house, which finally felt like a sanctuary again. When the final judgment was posted and the details of the case became public, the internet, the same community where I had shared my first angry post, felt like a digital cheering section. The story of the nurse versus the vultures went viral, and the comments were a testament to the fact that people still value loyalty over blood. User 1 commented, "The fact that they had to pay for Nolan's lawyer is the ultimate chef's kiss. They spent 16 years ignoring her and 6 months trying to rob her husband, and in the end, they literally paid for their own destruction. Poetic justice at its finest." User 2 wrote, "I can't stop thinking about the photo albums. Sylvia didn't just cut them out. She gave them exactly what they valued, the image of a family without the reality of the person. She was a genius." User 3 added, "As a chronic illness warrior myself, this story makes me want to stand up and cheer. We see who stays. We see who leaves. And I'm so glad Nolan and Sylvia got the last laugh." So, that brings us to the present. It has been 14 months since Sylvia died, and 2 weeks since Margaret and Richard officially put their Lexington house on the market to cover their debts. My father-in-law called me last night, crying on the voicemail, asking if I could find it in my heart to forgive the legal fees so they wouldn't have to move into a small apartment in their 70s. He said it was what Sylvia would have wanted. But I remember the Thanksgiving where she cried on my shoulder. I remember the ICU where she asked for her mother and no one came. I remember the look on their faces when they called me, just a nurse. I haven't called him back. I deleted the voicemail and went back to my work. But I have to ask you, the people who have followed this journey from the beginning, am I wrong for ignoring their pleas for mercy? Am I the villain they tried to make me out to be, or am I simply the executor of my wife's final, perfect plan? Thank you for listening to my story. If you found this journey as satisfying as I did, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story of justice and karma. Every bit of support helps us share these stories with more people. Until next time.